Hello everyone, just wanted to say thank you for joining me for another installment. We're now on to our new topic, which is social influences on behaviour. And you'll notice that we've jumped straight to dot point 4. We're skipping over the first 3 dot points because they are the ones that are most relevant for your SAC, and that obviously will be at the end of the unit. So it's really important that we're doing this information now and then that information when we are closer to your SAC. Hopefully you enjoy your little TED photo today. I caught him fast asleep and you can see his little teeth just hanging out the bottom there. So I thought that would be a nice one, considering I know how we're all lacking a little bit of motivation. So hopefully that made you giggle before we proceed. So the dot point that we're looking at this week is dot point 4, and it's quite a large dot point, but I think it is probably the most interesting dot point within all of your studies in Unit 1 and 2 psychology. And there's some really interesting experiments that have been done that we talk about in this dot point. So what I want you to be aware of, we are going to be looking at a guy called Zimbardo, and he's responsible for the Stanford prison experiment. So if you've heard that, it was on Netflix for a while there, but I'm not sure if it still is. And we're also going to have a look at groups and what that essentially means today. And then the recommendation is once you finish the information about Zimbardo, you stop the video and then you leave Milgram and Ash for tomorrow's lesson. Now that's totally up to you, but that's just my recommendation. So when we are looking at psychology, we look at this thing called social influence. So this essentially is just meaning how we are impacted by other people. Humans are quite social beings and we spend a lot of our time in the company of other people. So the idea of social influence is the effects of the actions of other people, either whether we are just imagining what they're doing, so you might think that someone's giving you a greasy when they're not really, or it could be real, and it's on the way that people think, feel and behave towards us. In our everyday activities, we interact and influence with others in a variety of different ways, like those listed: school, church, all of those kind of stuff. And each and every one of us is the byproduct or is the product of the relationships, the groups and the culture, as well as the society in which we belong to. And the person you are today is a result of the many interactions that you have with other people and the influence that they have over you. Now, a lot of the time we would like to hope that these influences are constructive, they're going to help us, they make us become a better person. However, sometimes they can be destructive, so they're quite harmful to us, like if people are recommending for you to partake in alcohol use or something like that. That's not necessarily it's not a good thing. Or it could have no effect. You may be pretty unfazed as to what that person is doing and how they are impacting you. So if you don't really like someone, then it's very unlikely that what they do or say is really going to have much of an impact on you. In all cases, however, social influence involves a degree of pressure, varying from slight to intense, that is exerted on an individual to change their thoughts, feelings or behaviours in some way. This pressure from others can be real or genuine pressure, or it can be imagined. That is, it doesn't actually occur, but it is still experienced as real pressure. We do not always give in to the pressure, and social influence can be and is often resisted, like we were talking about with the people you don't like earlier. So the first part of it is to actually understand what is a group versus just like a collection. So group, by definition, is any collection of 2 or more people who interact with and influence one another and who share a common purpose. And I think that, to me, is the key terminology that we need to be using within our responses. It's probably no surprise to you that you need at least 2 people to form a group, but there's not necessarily an upper limit for the people in a group. So you can have 900,000 or 9 million within a group. However, The number of people is just one of the characteristics in the group, and the actual number of individuals is not so important. What is important is that for a collection of people to be called a group, the individuals must interact with and influence one another, and they must also share a common goal. So, for example, if you're at a sporting match at the MCG, you may not necessarily interact with everyone within the stadium. However, once a Mexican wave starts going, then you all have this sense of belonging, you all have this common goal to get the wave around the stadium entirely. Also, a really component within a group is the sense of feeling like you belong in the group. But more importantly than the sense of belonging is that you feel part of the group. So those key features make groups very different to other collectives of people. Now there's a introduction task, a task 8, which is page 14 of your guidebook, and it's asking you about the different groups that you are in. So you need to estimate the number of the members of each group. How did you join each group? So did you have to enroll, or did someone invite you, or something along those lines? And why did you join the group? And sometimes that one's a little bit trickier to come up with. So have a go at task 8. Pause me now. And so that you can have a go at that particular task. This would also be a great opportunity to do your 2 learning activities for today. However, I am going to proceed with the next part. So either continue with the learning activities and the Adrolo here, or keep working through and leave those to the end of this particular topic. And we will finish at Zimbardo, or that's where you should finish for today's double. So status and social power, which is something that we're going to have a little bit of a look at when we look at things like Milgram and Ash's experiment. But from a general perspective, they are very heavily linked to the role that each individual has in a group. And in terms of psychology, a role is the behavior adopted by an individual or assigned to them that influences the way in which they function or act in different situations and life in general. Basically, a role is a part an individual plays in life that carries with it expectations of how to behave in different situations. We have many roles in everyday life, and some roles are relatively temporary in the context of our life, such as you're currently a student, you're not always going to be a student. And others are more permanent, such as you may be a parent or a friend or a brother or a female or a male. Regardless of whether a role is temporary or permanent though, once the role is taken on, there is usually an expectation by other members of the group that the individual will behave in a certain way that is consistent with that role. These role expectations have a strong influence on an individual's behaviour within a group, especially when their role provides considerable power and status. Generally, individuals tend to use their status and power in desirable ways and to the benefit of the group. In some cases, however, individuals misuse or abuse their power and status, and one of the most significant demonstrations of the effects of power and status is the experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which we're going to have a look at now. So I'm going to explain the experiment to you with this slide, but on the following slide, there is a video there for you. And I've included this in the announcement, labeling it Stanford's Prison Experiment within your announcement. There is a language warning for that video, so please be mindful. But if you've seen the Netflix video, then you're probably well-rounded with it, but it's such an interesting experiment. So but I'm going to explain it here. So the Stanford Prison Experiment was conducted in the summer of 1971 by an American psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, at Stanford University in California. And a lot of the time, people write that the Stanford Prison Experiment was conducted by Stanford, and it wasn't. It was conducted by Zimbardo at the Stanford University. Zimbardo wanted to find out the effects of roles, labels, and social expectations of being either a prison guard or a prisoner. To do this, he set up a simulated prison environment in the basement of the Stanford University Psychology Building, complete with cells, security doors, and drab surroundings without windows or light. Zimbardo's participants' selection procedure involved placing an advertisement in the local newspaper, inviting male volunteers for a study on prison life that would run for up to 2 weeks for the pay of $15 per day. More than 70 university students replied to the advertisement and were interviewed, and 24 of those judged to be normal, and I say that with inverted commas, average and healthy, were to be selected participants in the experiment. Equal numbers of participants were randomly allocated to either two of the experimental conditions, either a mock guard or a mock prisoner. This was achieved by the toss of a coin. The experiment actually commenced with 9 guards and 9 prisoners. The remaining guards and prisoners from the sample of 24 were on call in case they were needed. Having the role of prison guard carried considerable power and status within the entire group of the research participants. Having the role of prisoner carried minimal power and little or no status. As events unfolded, power, status, and role expectations associated with being a guard or prisoner brought about unexpected changes in their behaviour. To enhance reality, participants selected as prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police. This surprised the prisoners as they had been told to wait at home until they were contacted. Following their arrest, they were taken to a police station where they were searched, fingerprinted, and charged with committing offence. They were then taken to the mock prison where they were stripped naked, skin searched, sprayed for head lice, and issued with a uniform, bedding, soap, and a towel, and placed in a 2x3 metre barrel cell with 2 other prisoners. The prisoners were required to ask permission from the guards to perform routine activities such as using the toilet, smoking a cigarette, or writing letters. They were also required to refer themselves and each other only by their person numbers and to the guards as Mr. Correctional Officer. The guards were given military-style khaki uniforms to wear, clubs similar to batons, and whistles to use in maintaining order, and reflective sunglasses to conceal their identities and emotions. And you may know these sunglasses as like the aviators that are worn in all of the movies like Top Gun. So they worked 8-hour shifts and went home when they weren't on duty. Although instructed not to use physical violence, guards were allowed considerable freedom in developing rules and strategies to keep the prisoners under control. All of these procedures ensured the guards believed that they had considerable status and power. According to Zimbardo, their role was power-laden, and it took them only a day to adapt to their new, unfamiliar roles as dominating, powerful, and coercive. On the second day of their imprisonment, the prisoners staged a number of disturbances, but their rebellion was quickly stopped by the guards. Over the next few days, the guards behaved with increasing aggression and became more authoritarian. So they became more authoritative. They used their power to make their prisoners smile, laugh, or refrain from smiling or laughing on command for no apparent reason. They encouraged prisoners to call each other's names and made them do things like clean the toilets with their bare hands. The prisoners became increasingly traumatized, passive, and dehumanized, so they didn't feel human anymore. 4 prisoners had to be released during the first 4 days because of the reactions such as rage, hysterical crying, confusion, severe anxiety, and depression. One had to be released early after developing a rash all over his body. The rash was diagnosed as being stress-related. Each day, the guards abused their power, further tormenting the prisoners with more frequent commands, insults, and demanding tasks. Although the experiment had been planned to last for 2 weeks, it was terminated after 6 days because it was getting out of control. Every aspect of the prisoners' behaviour fell under the total and arbitrary control of the guards. However, the guards were abusing their power and becoming genuinely brutal and vicious towards the prisoners, who in turn were becoming withdrawn, submissive, and bitter. According to Zimbardo, we observed and documented on videotape the guards steadily increased in their coercive and aggressive tactics, humiliation and dehumanization of the prisoners day by day. The researchers had to remind the guards frequently to refrain from such abuses and displays of their dominating power and authority. Most of the participants never forgot how they had behaved in the experiment, whether they were guards or prisoners. And a number of the participants temporarily suffered emotional distress, which was not present prior to the experiment. At the conclusion of the experiment, one guard commented, "I was surprised at myself. I practically considered the prisoners cattle, and I kept thinking, I have to watch out for them in case they try something." While the prisoners were relieved that their ordeal was over, the guards were reluctant to give up their positions of power. The results of the experiment showed that the behaviour of normal, well-educated men can significantly be affected when the role they are given involves considerable power and status. Zimbardo believes that the findings of his experiment can be applied to the harsh and sometimes inhumane treatment of prisoners in real-life prisons. He believes that prisons are places that demean humanity and bring out the worst in social relations among people. They are as bad for the guards as the prisoners in terms of their destructive impact and continue to be places of evil that are failed experiments. Just before you have a look at the video, and remember it is linked in on the announcements, I just wanted to talk to you quickly about the ethical issue. So obviously this is really problematic, and it provides valuable insights into the effects of status and power on individual behaviour. But there are important ethical issues that have been criticised by many psychologists on these ethical grounds. Zimbardo has addressed these criticisms by arguing that his study was both ethical and unethical. It was not unethical because it followed the guidelines of the ethics committee that reviewed it and approved it. He says, "There was no deception. All participants were told in advance if they became prisoners, many of their usual rights would be suspended and they would have only minimally adequate diet and healthcare during the study. Their rights should have been protected by any of the many citizens who came to mock that prison, saw the deteriorated condition of those young men and yet did nothing to intervene. Among them, their own parents and friends on visiting nights, a Catholic priest, and many professional psychologists and staff of the psychology department, all of whom watched live-action videos of the study or took part in parole board hearings or spoke to participants and looked at them directly. Furthermore, we ended the study earlier than planned. Ended it against the wishes of the guards who felt that they finally had the situation under their control and that there would be no more disturbance or challenge by the prisoners." Zimbardo in 2015 stated that his study was unethical because people suffered and others were allowed to inflict pain and humiliation on their fellows over an extended period of time. All participants were exposed to seeing and hearing the suffering of prisoners who had done nothing to deserve punishment and abuse, and we did not end the study soon enough. We should have terminated as soon as the first prisoner suffered a severe distress disorder on day 2. So if you're wanting to have a look at the actual footage from the experiment, if you've seen the Netflix series, it's quite accurate. It's not entirely accurate, but feel free to have a look at this particular clip. Okay, so now is the point where you could be doing your 10.8 learning activity and your Adrolo. Now, the advice is to stop now and to do the rest on Wednesday's lesson. Okay, so I hope you are starting this on Wednesday's lesson, and we're going to have a look at obedience and conformity today with 2 different experiments of Milgram and Ash. So from a very early age, we learn that we need to be obedient when someone with legitimate authority over us commands us in some way or another to behave in a certain way. Obedience occurs when we follow the commands of someone with authority or the rules or laws of our society. Now, the idea is that someone of authority, particularly when we're young, is going to be our parents or an older sibling, might even be a teacher as well too. The term obedience is sometimes used interchangeably with the word compliance. However, while compliance involves changing one's behaviour in response to a request to do so, it does not necessarily involve an authority figure, whereas obedience does. Leaders in groups are often in the powerful position of being able to exert their influence over other members of the group. Why do other members usually obey the leader? Well, this question becomes important when the leader attempts to exert their power and influence over other group members, pushing them to behave in a manner that is different from the way in which they want to behave or would normally behave. There are several disturbing historical events that sparked interest in the questioning of obedience among psychologists. An example is the gassing, starving, and shooting of millions of Jewish people in concentration camps during World War II by Nazi soldiers under Hitler's direction. Psychologists often refer to this situation as one involving blind obedience to authority. Victims were usually unknown to their executioners and were, in the main, unseen. Did all of those Nazi soldiers who carried out Hitler's instructions support this course of action, or were they just following the orders as they stated? So Stanley Milgram then did research after Zimbardo. So he was interested in the idea of status and power, but he wanted to look at now how this led on to obedience. He completed his study in 1963 and investigated factors that can influence obedience to an authority figure. And in all, there were 19 variations of the experimental procedures to identify specific influences. He is one of Ash's critics. So Ash is an experimenter or a researcher who we're going to have a look at later. And as I will talk about, he had some personal attachments to looking at this in particular. So a lot of Milgram's work was attached to Nazi Germany and the idea of Hitler's reign and its impact on other people. And I'll talk about this in a couple of slides. But he was worried about what took place in the Nazi problem, and he wanted to provide evidence that Germans are different. So he wanted to suggest or to prove, essentially, even though we don't prove things in science, he wanted to find evidence to suggest that this was the way that Germans were hardwired to behave, and then the rest of the world was different to them. So this Germans are different hypothesis is essentially talking about the basic flaws or readiness to obey authority without question, no matter what the outrageous acts of authority commands. So he wanted to believe that there was something about the genetic makeup about Germans, the way that Germans were brought up, so their nature and their nurture, that made them more likely to be obedient, even in times when what they were being asked to do was so outlandish and really, really cruel. So the affiliations of this Nazi Germany and the almost blind following in many cases of Hitler sparked interest in an American psychologist called Stanley Milgram. And he decided that he wanted to look into obedience because he had cultural heritage and had a personal attachment to what had taken place, and he wanted to figure out why people behaved in such a way. As it stated on the slide, he wanted to look at the effects of obedience on New Haven Americans and then go to Germany and test this out on the German population to see if there was any alignment between the behaviours. For Milgram's first experiment, he advertised for 40 male research participants between the ages of 20 to 50 years, offering to pay them $4 for 1 hour of their time to participate in an experiment at the Yale University in the state of Connecticut. He wanted to find out whether participants would obey an authority figure who was instructing them to inflict pain on another person. Participants were informed of the experiment. However, what they were informed was that they were to be involved in a study on memory and learning, like you can see on the right-hand side there. So imagine yourself as one of the respondents to the advertisement and as one of Milgram's participants being treated in the following way. You arrive at the university to be met by one of Milgram's assistants in the experiment. He's dressed in a white laboratory cloak. You chat to the experimenter, who seems quite friendly, and the purpose of the research is explained. You and another participant who is unknown to you, and they're actually an actor or a confederate working for the experimenter, draw slips of paper to determine who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. Again, unknown to you, the draw is rigged so that the participant, which is you, always becomes the teacher, and the confederate or actor is always the experimenter's assistant, and they will always play the learner. So it's rigged in the setup that whoever is a participant within the experiment is a teacher, and the learner is always an actor or a research assistant. The learner is taken to an adjoining room, strapped into a chair, wired through the wall to an electric shock machine, and has electrodes placed on their wrists. You witness all of this before being taken to your seat in the next room and receiving instructions about your task to teach the learner to remember pairs of words. You are instructed that each time the learner makes a mistake, you are to deliver a brief shock of increasing intensity through a shock generator with 30 leveled markers at 15-volt intervals from 15 to 450 volts. The shock generator also has descriptions of the severity of the shock, levels from slight shock to danger to severe shock. On the first error, you are required to administer 15 volts and are to move up to the next higher voltage for each further error. With each flick of the switch, the lights flash and an electric buzzing sound fills the room. Deliberately, the learner, who remember is an actor, makes errors. By the fifth error, which would equal 75 volts, you hear a grunt from the next room. If you question the experimenter as to whether to continue, you receive a standard reply. The experiment requires that you must continue. Then, if you show further reluctance to continue administering the shocks, you are told it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. If you continue to administer the shocks after the eighth error, which is the equivalent to 120 volts, the learner cries out. At 150 volts, the learner demands to be let out. At 180, the learner cries and they cannot stand the pain any longer. And at 300 volts, the learner refuses to continue and becomes silent. How would you feel as a teacher at this point? How far would you go in administering the shocks? How obedient would you be in this situation? So here we have the Milgram experiment video, and again, this has been linked into today's announcement, similar to the way that the Zimbardo one was. After the experiment, all participants, or the teachers, were debriefed and informed that the learners did not actually receive any of the electric shocks and that they were actors or confederates of the experiment. The results were unexpected. Of the 40 participants, none stopped administering the shocks before 300 volts. 26 continued to administer shocks at the 450 volt level. 5 participants refused to go on with the experiment at 300 volts when the learner began kicking the walls. Milgram's experiment attracted a great deal of interest among psychologists, and many variations of his standard experiment were subsequently conducted in other countries such as Australia. These studies produced a range of results, with the level of obedience found to be higher in some studies and lower in others, obviously in comparison to Milgram. However, there was still an occurrence of obedience at a significant level in all of these experiments. So the answer to that hypothesis is no. We were seeing many of the results in Australia, Austria, England, Germany, Italy, Jordan, Spain, the Netherlands, some in Poland. All of this behaviour was happening everywhere. Milgram's original experiment on obedience to an authority figure used a sample made up of entirely adult male participants. In subsequent experiments, such as in 1974, he used an experiment or had an experiment where it tested the effects of other variables on obedience. For example, in another study, 40 adult females showed the same level of obedience as did the males. So 65% of participants delivered an electric shock to the maximum intensity of 450 volts. Similar results have also been obtained in different countries throughout the world, using people from different socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds, including children and elderly people, in the role of the teacher. Most participants expressed considerable distress as to what they were being asked to do, yet most almost continued to obey. In sum, obedience in Milgram's type experimental situations seem to occur regardless of gender, socioeconomic background, age, or culture. Does this mean that you would be more likely to obey an authority figure to deliver 450 volts that could kill someone? The answer is no, not necessarily. It appears that several factors interact in influencing someone to obey an authority figure. These factors include the physical distance between the authority figure and the person who they must obey, who must obey, whether the authority figure is perceived as being legitimate and having power, and a group pressure to obey. So those key factors are presented on the slides there. Now here, social proximity refers to the closest between two or more people. This may include the physical distance between people as well as the closeness of their relationship. So you can see here within this graph, it is highlighted here. It also may be looking at the holding the hand on the plate. Also might be looking at the teacher being out of the room. So those all could be dealing with social proximity. The second factor is the legitimacy of the authority figure. An individual is also more likely to be obedient when the authority figure is perceived to be legitimately having power. So this is in comparison to an ordinary kind of person. So in this particular one, orders are given by an ordinary person rather than an experimenter. So that one is very heavily linked to the legitimacy. The final one that we look at is group pressure by placing the teacher with two Confederate teachers. Initially, the two Confederates pretended to collaborate by agreeing to follow the shock administration procedure. Then they pretended to defy the experimenter and refused to administer the shocks after 150 volts to 210 volts. The results indicated that after the participant observed this disobedience, the Confederates turned to the participant and ordered them to administer the shock. Almost 90% refused to do so. The results also indicated that an individual is more likely to be obedient where there is group support for the authority figure. So you can see here in this one, teacher observes two others that disobey, and the teacher observes two others to obey. That's the group pressure side of things. The terms cult and sect are often used interchangeably because they have some common features. They are, however, different types of groups. The key distinction is the separateness of the identity of the group. A cult is a group which claims to have great devotion to some person, some idea, or object. A cult usually has a religious base, and there is a living, charismatic, and influential leader who is often seen as guiding the spirit behind the religious beliefs and practices of the group. On the contrary, a sect is a group that follows a particular set of principles, beliefs, and practices, and which has a separate identity within a larger group or organization. A sect is generally a faction, a breakaway group within a larger group, and is often not formally recognized by the larger group. There are many cults and sects throughout the world, and most cults and many sects establish their own set of social norms that are often different from those of the rest of society. One of the most well-known cults was established in the 60s by Reverend Jim Jones. Initially located in Indiana in the US, Jones relocated his congregation to Guyana, in South America, where he set up his own community called Jonestown. Jones was extremely influential over his group of loyal followers. This particular cult is referenced in the 1978 Jonestown massacre. So the mass media around the world were filled with horrific scenes and stories from Guyana in South America, where close to 1,000 people died at Jonestown under the direction of Reverend Jim Jones. The members of the Joneses People's Temples fed a poison-laced drink to their children, administered the potion to their infants, and then drank it themselves. Their bodies were found lying together, arm in arm. 911 of them perished. So in the next slide, we have another video in here. I want you to take note of the following key points here. Please do not watch the video if you find the content distressing. Here would be a good point to do 10.9 and 10.10 learning activities and a Drolo. If not, you can continue on with the final installment about ASH. At various times in our lives, we all experience group pressure to conform. It's kind of like, it is peer pressure. Conformity is the tendency to adjust one's thoughts, feelings, or behaviour in ways that are in agreement with those of a particular individual or group, or with accepted of standards about how a person should behave in certain situations. For example, conformity occurs when someone does something, such as swearing, which they don't normally do to go along with the rest of the group who all swear. Conformity also occurs when we wear a formal evening dress or a suit rather than jeans to a deb, or stand rather than sit when the national anthem is played at a sports event. Psychologists have conducted many experiments to understand various conditions under which conformity occurs. One of the best known series of experiments on conformity was conducted by a Polish-born American psychologist called Solomon Asch in the 1950s. In several classic experiments, Asch investigated group pressure to conform. In different experiments, Asch studied factors that he believed influence conformity, such as group size and whether or not the group is unanimous, that means in complete agreement, or what should be said or done. In one of the experiments conducted by Asch, the participant came into a room that contained 6 other people, and the experimenter sat at the end of a long table, in a chair that had been purposefully left vacant. Each participant was told that they were taking part in a psychological experiment on visual. The experimenter then showed 2 cards to the group. One card was a single vertical line, and on the second card were 3 vertical lines, as you can see in the images on the slide. The participant was asked to select the line from the second card that matched the length of the line on the first card. In total, there were 18 trials, each using a different pair of cards. In some of the trials, the difference in the length of the lines was hardly noticeable, so the matching line was difficult to identify. In other trials, the 3 lines were noticeably different. Now, for those of you who did Year 10 psychology with me last year, this might be pretty familiar to you if I speak to you about the Smarty experiment. The participants were not aware that the other people around the table were Confederates, like actors like we spoke about last time. These Confederates had been instructed to answer correctly for some of the trial and to answer incorrectly for majority of the trials. After hearing the Confederates' answers, the participants had to decide between giving the same answer as the others in the group, even though on many trials their answer was obviously incorrect, or giving the answer they believed was correct. About 75% of the participants agreed with the Confederates' incorrect responses at least once during the trials. About 33% of the participants agreed with incorrect responses in half or more of the trials. However, 24% of the participants did not conform to the incorrect responses given by the Confederates at all. When the participants in Asch's experiment were questioned later, all reported experiencing some degree of self-doubt about their opinion as to which lines matched up. Those participants who had generally conformed and agreed with the answers the Confederates gave said that they were aware that their responses and the Confederates were wrong, but they went along with the group because they did not want to spoil the experimenter's results, and they did not want to generate disharmony or conflict within the group. Some of the participants who gave the correct response went so far as to apologise for correctly responding. Those participants who did not conform said they felt conspicuous and crazy, like a misfit, when they gave the answers that disagreed with the rest of the group. Prior to his experiments, Asch hypothesised that people would not conform in situations where they could clearly see what was correct and what was incorrect. Although most of the university students who were research participants in his experiments did not conform to the group pressure that was exerted on them, many did. Asch made his views about this clearly. That reasonably intelligent and well-meaning young people are willing to call white, black, is a cause of concern. Asch's findings also aroused interest among other psychologists, and a great deal of research on conformity followed. On the basis of Asch's and other research findings, a number of key factors that influence conformity have been proposed. This includes the size of the group, whether or not the group members are unanimous in their views, whether the group is viewed as being a valuable source of information, awareness of accepted standards about how one should behave, cultural background, social loafing, and anonymity within the group. Okay, so the first two are normative influence and culture. So, normative influence to conform occurs when our response in a group situation is guided by one or more social norms. When we're aware of social norms for a particular situation, awareness of these norms can be a powerful influence on both the likelihood that we will conform and the strength of conformity that occurs. A useful way of meeting these needs for acceptance and approval is to be as similar to others as possible. From a really young age, at home and at school in particular, we learn to agree with others and behave in the same way that they do, creates in itself positive results. People are likely to like us and to accept us and may even give us praise or approval when we conform. In regards to culture, the highest levels of conformity are said to have occurred in collectivist cultures, where individuals tend to be encouraged and sometimes expected to place group goals ahead of their personal goals. These are cultures that encourage uniformity and values and beliefs that promote conformity and fitting in for the good of the wider community rather than individuality. Informational influence occurs when conformity results from a need for direction and information on how to respond in a specific situation. Informational influence leads people to accept other people's views when they are uncertain about what to do. Unanimity means complete agreement among group members. And then finally, group size. Results show, particularly related to Ash's experiment, that conformity increases with group size up to a size of 4. Beyond a group size of 4 confederates in Ash's example, conformity did not continue to increase significantly. So it seems that there's a bit of a threshold there. De-individuation is the loss of individuality or the sense of anonymity that can occur in a group situation. De-individuation is a psychological state and is believed to be an important factor in explaining the extreme behaviour of some people in crowds, particularly in situations where high levels of emotion are involved. And then finally, social loafing refers to the tendency of an individual to make less effort when involved in a group activity than when working alone. And if you did you did psychology with me last year in Year 10, this would have been something that we looked at. It's also tested when people try and build bridges and stuff with marshmallows and spaghettis. You might have done that earlier on in life. Essentially, we look at for those people who kind of just sit back and let everyone else take over, which is what social loafing is. Okay, so that is everything. Hopefully you've taken a lot of breaks throughout that. And the final learning activity is 10.14 and you have your conformity Adrolo. Thanks for listening.